Since the dawn of the radio, the music industry has been somewhat of a rigged game. Through a method known as payola, DJs have accepted bribes from labels to play certain songs for decades. Since the 1960s, the US government has tried to make it go away. However, there's strong evidence that this is still going on even today. In 1956, rock and roll had taken over youth culture in America, and Elvis Presley was such a threat to society he was almost arrested for dancing. While appearing for several shows in Jacksonville, Florida, one judge wanted him prosecuted for the crime of gyrating his hips. Numa Seiselin, the president of Florida Theater, said, Marion Gooding, who was at the time the juvenile court justice in Jacksonville, summoned young Mr. Presley to his offices and told him there would be no hip swiveling and no suggestive body movements. The judge believed that Elvis's dance moves were impairing the morality of minors. This was following reports that fans would sometimes try to run up on stage at Elvis and rip up his clothes. So what does that got to do with payola? Well, the rumor circulating at the time was that the growth of rock and roll was not something organic, but artists were emerging through the music industry's equivalent of taking steroids. Behind the scenes, a lucrative and sophisticated process known as payola was underway, where numerous tracks on the radio were not played by merit, but through bribes. Payola was a term that predated rock and roll. It was coined in 1916 by Variety magazine through combining the words pay and Victrola, which referred to a record player. However, in the 1950s, payola was simply rampant. In 1950, there were 250 disc jockeys in the US, but by 1957, there were over 5,000. This was partly due to the fact that the volume of records had dramatically increased, as well as major labels. There was also a significant increase in independent ones, and a lot of rock and roll artists came through these new independent labels. While on the surface payola looks unethical, it did help address the imbalance within the music industry. So while I described it earlier as like taking steroids, you could argue that it was actually providing a level playing field for independent labels. Payola was arranged through something known as the $50 handshake. This term was coined by the New York businessman Hi Weiss, who worked for multiple record labels before starting his own label called Old Town Records. He believed that labels did not have to build strong relationships with radio DJs to play their records, and instead, they could just pay them up front. It was based on the age-old principle that money talks. According to Weiss, why waste time going out with someone you don't like and sit down and feast with them when you can't stand them? Just give them the money and let them play the effing record. At the time, the radio was one of the few avenues that people got to listen to new music. So whether a record sold 10 or 10,000 copies depended on how much money was contained within this handshake. And it wasn't just a $50 handshake. The shape and size of this payola depended on the DJ and how much power they had. A mid-level DJ would typically get $50 a week for an agreed-upon amount of plays on the radio. Payola would also come in the form of a percentage of how much they made in concerts, or sometimes they would be paid with free records or lavish trips. DJs would often disguise these bribes in their books as consultancy fees. In a strange twist of fate, the widespread form of bribery would only come to light through another scandal. As well as rock and roll, TV quiz shows were also becoming an incredibly popular form of entertainment, and they were running a little scam of their own. In November of 1956, an ordinary man named Charles Van Doren appeared on the NBC quiz show 21. Quiz shows invited ordinary members of the public, but Van Doren was seen to have an encyclopedic knowledge of multiple subjects, and viewers were witnessing some sort of genius at work in front of their eyes. Viewers were glued to the phenomenal knowledge that Doren displayed on their television set. He spent 14 weeks on the show and walked away with $129,000 in winnings. According to the New York Times, he had also appeared on the cover of Time magazine, received some 20,000 fan letters, brushed off dozens of marriage proposals, and signed a $150,000 contract to appear on NBC shows for 3 years. However, his fellow contestant Herb Stempel blew the whistle on what was going on. Stempel admitted that he had answers supplied to him by the show and agreed to bow out so that Van Doren could win. By doing this, he was given $50,000 in winnings. The truth was that Van Doren's triumphant quiz show run was a fabricated story that the producers thought its audience would find more entertaining. To counteract this deceptive behavior, Congress got involved. All quiz shows were taken off the air and regulations were put in place. The success of this investigation spurred on an investigation into another festering rumor in broadcasting, and payola was given the limelight it desperately sought to avoid. In 1959, 335 DJs from across the country were called to testify before Congress. The revelations were astounding. The DJs were revealed to have received over $263,000 in, quote, consulting fees. one DJ claimed to have taken $22,000 to play a single record. Alan Freed and Dick Clark, two of the biggest DJs at the time, were then called forward. Dick Clark's payola revealed that it was much more than slipping cash in someone's pocket. There were songs that he owned that he played on the radio and was essentially paying himself through radio plays. And rather suspiciously, he was sometimes credited as a songwriter, despite having no musical career whatsoever. Dick Clark was a big star through his show on ABC, and the network ordered him to divest his interest from the music industry before the trial, and this saved him from any criminal punishment. His fellow DJ Alan Freed would not be so lucky. Freed denied taking payola but refused to sign an affidavit saying so. When it was looked into, he was charged with 26 counts of commercial bribery and was fired from his radio station WABC. He received numerous fines and a suspended jail sentence. His career was finished, too, because he was blacklisted afterward, and Freed was arguably made the sacrificial lamb. Everybody and anybody was taking part in this, but it was Freed who was made to pay the price. And this was a move that disproportionately affected rock and roll artists and especially African American musicians. According to the Straight Dope, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, ASCAP, accused Broadcast Music Incorporated, BMI, a performers' rights organization, of using payola to ensure airplay for BMI artists. BMI at the time represented most of the black and southern musicians who were the leading force behind rock and roll, so one could make the argument that there was some racial animus involved. Freed's fate became a cautionary tale. However, this punishment did not seem to have much effect on the industry. In fact, it got even worse. In 1960, Congress made an amendment that broadcasters were required to disclose if airplay for a song was purchased. However, there was an obvious loophole that was used to overcome this law. Instead of a $50 handshake between the label and the DJ, there could be two separate handshakes if you introduced an independent promoter. These independent promoters were nicknamed indies. Eric Bollert from Salon wrote, "The indies are the shadowy middlemen record companies will pay hundreds of millions of dollars to this year to get songs played on the radio. Indies align themselves with certain radio stations by promising the stations promotional payments in the six figures. Then every time the radio station adds a Shaggy or a Madonna or Janet Jackson song to its playlist, the indie gets paid by the record label." In 2002, New York's Attorney General Eliot Spitzer conducted an in-depth investigation into labels directly paying for radio play. This uncovered numerous instances of blatant payola. In one example, Columbia Records emailed a radio station with, "Do you need help on Jessica Simpson this week? $12.50? If you don't need help, I certainly don't need to play it." However, in this investigation, there were genuine penalties. Several major labels and stations were penalized millions of dollars, and the proceeds went to music education charities and nonprofits. Going forward, labels and radio stations were asked to, quote, "not use contests or giveaways, commercial transactions, advertising, artist appearances, and performances in an explicit or implicit exchange, agreement, or understanding to obtain airplay or increase airplay." And despite this slap on the wrist, payola has persisted, but in an even more sophisticated way. It's not a simple handshake, nor does it simply involve adding a middleman. It involves collaborative business partnerships. An anonymous promoter told Rolling Stone, "Unlike the old days when a programmer might take home $1,250 for spinning Jessica Simpson, the toll doesn't always go into the radio programmer's pocket today. Instead, what the stations need the money for is to go toward marketing, quote unquote. That might include buying advertising time on the airwaves, or billboards in the market, or putting money toward products like t-shirts and bumper stickers that publicize both the radio station and the record label." However, there are many people watching that simply don't listen to the radio and think that makes them free from payola. Well, there are some interesting aspects of streaming platforms that suggest that these are subject to manipulation too. George Howard, a professor at the Berklee College of Music, argued that the changing landscape of how we consume music could remove pay-for-play activity from the industry. In 2011, he optimistically wrote, "Up until recently, there weren't alternatives, but now with internet radio, satellite radio, subscription services, and your own playlists on your iPod, iPhone, the alternatives abound. Our challenge and opportunity is to not allow these alternatives to follow the same path that traditional radio went down." But fast forward to the 2020s, and you could argue that the new formats of hearing new music are still tied to the pay-for-play model. Some have claimed that Spotify's Discovery Mode is another form of, quote, payola, considering the fact that the major record labels all own stock in Spotify and other major streaming platforms, allowing them to license their music. Pandora has also entered a deal with the music rights group Merlin to steer its algorithms towards playing their music, which Pandora in turn will be given lower rates to license. An investigation by Billboard into streaming sites found that playlists have become valuable currency in streaming's new world order, so much so that record companies now actively promote and sometimes pay for their songs to appear on such services as Spotify, Deezer, and Apple Music. As the old saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Make sure to subscribe for more.